The 8th of March 1983, RAF Bentwaters, Suffolk, United Kingdom. Overcast skies. Low coastal fog. Wind steady from the North Sea. Visibility poor. The morning began like so many others along NATO's eastern flank, grey, silent, and heavy with the unspoken weight of a divided world. Over the twin runways of RAF Bentwaters, vapour drifted in long strips, clinging to fuel-stained concrete and the skeletal outlines of revetments. Every distant sound, an engine test, a loose metal panel rattling in the wind, seemed to echo longer than it should, swallowed by the fog, returned as a muted metallic hum. Inside the 81st Tactical Fighter Wing's primary radar facility, the atmosphere was equally subdued. The room glowed in alternating bands of amber and green as technicians monitored scopes that traced the same familiar arcs across the North Sea and northern Germany. Cigarette smoke coiled lazily in the air, trapped beneath fluorescent lights. Low radio chatter drifted between the consoles, punctuated only by the intermittent sweep tone of the long-range search radar. For the watch officers on duty, it was simply another quiet shift during a month of heightened alerts. Intelligence briefings had warned of increased Soviet aerial training near the Baltic approaches. NATO commanders expected routine probes, nothing novel, nothing that the region's sophisticated radar network had not catalogued 100 times. Yet even in routine, tension remained constant. On the far side of the continent, Soviet air defense forces were conducting their own silent vigils. In a sealed control bunker outside Kaliningrad, officers of the 54th Air Defense Corps tracked NATO patrol routes with methodical precision. Their radar scopes flickered in the dimly lit compartment, tracing the arcs of American reconnaissance flights, the predictable patterns of British maritime patrol aircraft, and the occasional high-altitude intrusions of electronic intelligence platforms. Each contact was logged, cross-referenced, and relayed back through secure channels to higher command. Both sides believed they understood the other's reactions. Both sides believed the balance, delicate though it was, remained stable. But in the early hours of the 8th of March, small irregularities began to ripple across the observational picture. At Bentwaters, the primary long-range radar displayed minor distortions, brief but unusual fade-outs in a narrow corridor over the North Sea. At first, the watch officer attributed the anomaly to weather interference. The fog and cold, combined with drifting sea air, sometimes created refractive pockets that confused the lower beams. Still, the technicians took note. In a climate of sharpened alertness, every inconsistency was treated with quiet suspicion. Further east, aboard the U.S. Navy's guided missile cruiser USS Yorktown, operating near the Norwegian Sea, sonar operators reported intermittent disturbances, metallic echoes shifting against the background wash of the ocean. The signatures were faint, irregular, and did not correspond to any known Soviet submarine pattern. The signals were archived, flagged for later analysis, and forwarded along the ship's command network. None of these isolated irregularities drew immediate alarm, but they formed the earliest threads of a pattern neither side could yet see. By midday, the weather at Bentwaters worsened. Wind gusts swept across the flight line, tugging at tie-down chains and scattering loose sand. Maintenance crews moved between aircraft with measured haste, their parkas pressed flat by the gale. On the far end of the apron, a line of A-10 Thunderbolts sat in hardened shelters, while a pair of F-15C interceptors remained on alert status, fueled and armed. Inside the radar room, the lead controller, Captain Ernest Mallory, reviewed the day's operational logs. His eyes drifted repeatedly to the faint distortion corridor that had plagued the system since dawn. He requested a secondary system check, but the technicians reported no faults. The equipment appeared sound. Mallory considered elevating the matter to the Regional Command Center at RAF High Wycombe but hesitated. In a period of escalating drills and posturing between east and west, radar anomalies were a daily occurrence. Reporting every irregularity risked clogging already burdened channels. Still, something felt off, a subtle dissonance in the pattern, as if an unseen object were maneuvering at the outer edge of detection. Across the Iron Curtain, Soviet radar crews were noticing something similar. Within the concrete bunker outside Kaliningrad, Senior Lieutenant Viktor Mikhailov studied a faint, intermittent blip moving against the grain of NATO air corridors. The signal was unstable, vanishing and reappearing with irregular rhythm. Mikhailov assumed it to be a malfunction, possibly atmospheric clutter, but logged it nonetheless. Moments later, the anomaly dropped from the screen entirely. By late afternoon, the fog at Bentwaters thickened into a dense blanket, muffling the roar of departing aircraft. A single F-15C performed a short test sortie, disappearing into the low ceiling with its afterburners casting a brief orange flare across the mist. The pilot reported turbulent pockets above the coastline, but nothing unusual. At 1,600 hours, a sharp burst of static cut across the primary monitoring channel. Several scopes flickered simultaneously before regaining clarity. The distortion corridor vanished. In its place, the radar picture appeared cleaner than it had all day, clear, distinct, almost unnaturally so. Mallory leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. Something had changed. But before the duty crew could assess the shift, a new contact appeared on the far edge of the identification range, faint, unresolved, but moving fast. Too fast for a patrol aircraft. Too low for a strategic bomber. And positioned, impossibly, inside the very airspace the earlier anomalies had suggested was empty. Mallory issued a quiet order to begin tracking. No one yet knew that the radar return would soon defy multiple systems across NATO's integrated defense network. No one suspected that a Soviet aircraft, one believed incapable of reaching this position unnoticed, had materialized exactly where the watch officers had concluded it could not be. The incident that followed would strain established intelligence assumptions, prompt emergency calls across 3 NATO command centers, and trigger a confrontation that remained classified for decades. The unidentified contact held steady on the Bentwaters scope, tracing a shallow arc across the North Sea boundary. Its radar cross-section was small but unusually consistent, neither fading nor fluctuating the way atmospheric interference normally did. Captain Mallory requested confirmation from the adjacent tracking station at Neatershed. Their reply arrived after several tense minutes. No contact detected. Sector clear. Mallory stared at the scope again. His technicians performed a manual calibration, but the return did not waver. The object was real, at least on their system, and it was moving toward a corridor patrolled regularly by U.S. Air Forces in Europe. He ordered an immediate cross-check with AWACS coverage over the central North Sea. The Airborne Command aircraft reported heavy cloud interference but no corresponding track. Mallory's unease deepened. A single radar anomaly could be dismissed, but a contact detected by one system and invisible to all others suggested something far more troubling, either a sophisticated form of masking or an aircraft operating in a manner NATO had not anticipated. At 1,614 hours, protocol dictated escalation. Mallory notified the Sector Operations Center and requested readiness status on the alert interceptors. The phone call traveled through 3 layers of command before authorization was granted. Bentwaters went to quick reaction alert. In less than 2 minutes, the on-duty ground crews sprinted to the F-15 shelter. Cables were unplugged, ladders pulled back, and the twin-engine fighters began their startup sequence, engines spooling to a high, resonant whine that cut through the fog-shrouded base. Inside the radar facility, new information arrived from the Danish Air Force. Their early warning station on Bornholm had registered 2 abrupt spikes of electronic noise, intense but fleeting, aligned with the same vector Mallory was tracking. The Danish report suggested a possible emissions burst consistent with radar or targeting systems being cycled on and off. 2 bursts. 2 signals. And now 1 contact. Mallory relayed the data to the intercept controllers, who began formulating a vector for the F-15s. The fighters would need a positive secondary detection before crossing into international airspace. Until then, their ascent would be controlled strictly inside NATO boundaries. Across the Baltic region, Soviet personnel were conducting their own chain of reactions. In the Kaliningrad bunker, Senior Lieutenant Mikhailov rechecked his logs. The strange intermittent blip he had tracked earlier remained unexplained. Minutes later, a coded message arrived from Western Military District Headquarters, elevated readiness condition. The directive was terse, providing no explanation, but it was enough to tighten procedures throughout the command chain. Farther north, at a forward airbase outside Chkalovsk, ground crews were preparing aircraft for evening training sorties. Among them sat a newly introduced model, sleek, angular, and still classified in most of its operational parameters. Its pilots referred to it simply by its development designation. Western analysts knew only fragments. It was meant to challenge NATO air superiority, but its exact capabilities remained a guarded secret of the Soviet Air Forces. By 1630 hours, the unidentified contact on the Bentwaters radar had shifted course again, descending slightly, speed increasing. Its projected path now intersected directly with one of NATO's major air corridors. Mallory ordered an immediate relay to the Air Defense Operations Center. Tension rose further when Netashed finally confirmed a faint, unstable return, barely above the noise threshold. They were no longer alone in seeing it. The interception order followed within minutes. The two F-15Cs lifted off through the fog, afterburners casting rippling heat waves across the runway. The fighters climbed rapidly, banking east toward the North Sea. Their onboard radars were activated, sweeping ahead in wide search patterns. For the first several minutes, their screens showed only dense static from the turbulent weather. Inside the Bentwaters radar room, the contact blinked, vanished, then reappeared 20 miles further along its vector, as if it had covered impossible distance in a fraction of the time. A technician whispered an alarmed remark before catching himself and returning to professional silence. Mallory stepped closer to the screen. A transponder code flashed briefly, but not one registered in NATO identification databases. The numbers vanished before they could be logged. He relayed the new bearing to the intercept controllers, who directed the F-15s to accelerate. The lead pilot, callsign Falcon 1, acknowledged the command. His breathing was steady, clipped, professional. "No joy," he repeated in intervals. "Continuing search." But 30 seconds later, Falcon 1 caught something, a faint radar spike at extreme range, inconsistent but present. Not a ghost. Not weather. Something metallic, airborne, and maneuvering. He radioed the detection, and for the first time, the pilots altered their tone. They sharpened their ascent, climbing above the cloud deck. Evening light broke across their canopies as they leveled out. Back at Bentwaters, the radar picture changed again. A second contact appeared, only for an instant, just behind the first. Then it vanished. Mallory felt the tension rise through the room like an electrical charge. Two contacts suggested a formation, or a shadowing maneuver. But the second return was so brief it could have been a system glitch. He had no certainty to offer the intercept controllers. At 1,646 hours, the situation escalated once more. The AWACS unit, which had previously seen nothing unusual, reported a sudden spike on its long-range radar. A fast-moving aircraft, high-performance profile, low-altitude penetration. Its vector matched Bentwaters' primary track exactly. Mallory's staff exchanged uneasy glances. The AWACS was among NATO's most advanced airborne sensors. If it had finally detected the intruder, the aircraft was flying with deliberate precision, either masking itself or operating just outside known detection envelopes. The F-15s surged forward under new instructions: identify the contact, establish visual if possible, and determine whether it was Soviet. Neither side yet understood what was unfolding. But along the Baltic coast, Soviet readiness levels increased again. A standby fighter unit received coded orders. Hangar doors shifted open. Engines began warming. The stage, without either alliance fully intending it, was aligning toward confrontation. And within 12 minutes, the unidentified aircraft would appear exactly where no NATO radar believed it could be, triggering the most alarming moment of the entire incident. The first clear visual came at 1,658 hours, high above the fractured cloud deck, where the last amber light of the afternoon cut narrow paths across the sky. Falcon 1 had climbed to intercept altitude, holding formation with Falcon 2 at a shallow angle as both fighters swept eastward. Their radar scopes showed the same elusive spike, never stable, never fully opaque, but present enough to demand pursuit. Then, without warning, the spike surged into clarity. Contact, 20 miles. High closure rate, Falcon 1 reported. His voice tightened, though he kept his tone professional. Profile, unknown. At Bentwaters, Mallory listened with a growing sense of inevitability. The unknown track that had flirted with NATO's detection grid for hours was finally revealing itself. He relayed the updated vector to higher command, who issued a terse directive: maintain intercept, avoid escalation unless fired upon. As the F-15s closed the distance, the cloud layer below them broke apart. Shadows moved across the white expanse. A faint shimmer of metal caught the light. And then it appeared. An angular silhouette emerged through the fading sunlight, sleek, compact, and unlike any aircraft NATO pilots had yet seen in the open. Falcon 1 reacted instinctively, banking to maintain position. His breath froze for an instant. Visual contact, unknown fighter. Not Fulcrum A prototype lines, not any variant I've seen. There was a pause, then a measured correction. Possibly MiG-29, but configuration is different. In the Bentwaters radar room, Mallory felt the atmosphere shift. The MiG-29 was known only through intelligence estimates and grainy photographs. It was believed to be confined to limited Soviet evaluation units and far from deployment range of the North Sea. Yet one was now airborne directly in front of NATO interceptors, positioned precisely where earlier radar plots insisted no aircraft had entered. The F-15s tightened their formation, descending slightly to gain positional advantage. The intruder made no evasive move. Instead, it held an almost unsettling straight and level path, as if inviting inspection. "Maintain spacing," the intercept controller warned. "Do not provoke." But the Soviet pilot needed no provocation. Without altering throttle signature, the unknown MiG executed a perfect climbing roll, smooth, deliberate, measured. It passed above the F-15s, inverted briefly, then leveled off behind them at a distance barely exceeding visual safety margin. In the cockpit, Falcon 2 exhaled sharply. One officer later recalled, the documentary would note decades later, that the maneuver was a demonstration, not a challenge. The maneuver should not have been possible under the aircraft's believed performance limits. Western estimates suggested the MiG-29 prototypes suffered from stability issues at high altitude. Yet the Soviet fighter held posture flawlessly. At Bentwaters, Mallory's voice cut sharply across the radio channel. "Falcon flight, brake. Regain position. Do not allow the unknown to sit on your 6. The F-15s responded immediately, splitting formation in a defensive scissors maneuver. The MiG did not pursue either aircraft. Instead, it drifted upward, maintaining a parallel track. Then something happened that neither side expected. Bentwaters' radar picture dissolved into static. AWACS reported the same. At Neatershed, the display froze entirely. For 50 seconds, every NATO long-range system monitoring the encounter went blind. Yet the Soviet fighter remained fully visible, to the naked eye of the F-15 pilots above the clouds, maneuvering with controlled ease. "Bentwaters, we've lost picture," Mallory reported to Regional Command. His technicians frantically checked systems. Nothing appeared damaged. Nothing malfunctioned. It was as if the MiG's presence alone had pushed the sensors beyond reliability. In the Baltic region, Soviet technicians were experiencing the opposite phenomenon, an overabundance of clarity. Their new tracking arrays reported 3 aircraft in tight proximity, 2 NATO fighters and a single Soviet design. The data was crisp, unusually so, as if the unknown MiG were broadcasting a beacon. Soviet command issued a new directive: monitor, but do not engage. They too were observing a test. At 1,703 hours, the aerial chess match escalated. The MiG abruptly dropped altitude, slicing through a break in the cloud bank. The F-15s dove in pursuit. Wind buffeted their airframes as they descended toward the turbulent lower layers. The Soviet fighter slowed, intentionally. It allowed one F-15 to close distance, drifting into a position that suggested challenge. Falcon 1 moved incautiously, aligning to identify markings. For a moment, he could see them with startling clarity: a non-standard paint scheme, no unit insignia, and a tailcode inconsistent with any known Soviet regiment. He began to report the markings when the MiG suddenly lit its afterburners. A column of flame erupted from its twin engines, and the aircraft shot upward with a burst so violent that both F-15s were forced to break pursuit to avoid exceeding structural limits. Acceleration unmatched, Falcon 2 breathed. Climb rate, unbelievable. AWACS regained radar picture just in time to see the unknown aircraft burst through the upper altitude bands. It ascended beyond the intercept envelope, then leveled before turning east at extreme speed. At Bentwaters, Mallory relayed final pursuit authorization, but the pilots needed none. They accelerated, engines straining at maximum output, but the MiG was simply too fast. Within minutes, the Soviet aircraft had crossed beyond the aerial boundary NATO could legally pursue. As the F-15s reached fuel constraint thresholds, the intercept controller issued the call no one wanted to hear. Falcon flight, terminate pursuit. Return to base. The tension in the cockpit reports was unmistakable. The pilots had encountered an aircraft that should not have been operational, should not have been deployed, and should not have been capable of entering that airspace unseen. The MiG was gone, heading east, towards Soviet territory, leaving behind more questions than answers. But the most disturbing detail would not be discovered until hours later, when radar logs, cross-channel systems reports, and intelligence intercepts were analyzed. Because the place the MiG had appeared, the place multiple NATO systems insisted it could not reach, was not simply unexpected. It was impossible according to every known flight corridor, distance calculation, and radar coverage model of the early 1980s. The F-15s returned to RAF Bentwaters shortly after 1810 hours, descending through the same dense fog that had covered the base since morning. Their landing was quiet, almost subdued, despite the urgency of what they had witnessed. Ground crews approached with the usual efficiency, but the pilots' expressions, grim, focused, unsettled, silenced the informal greetings normally exchanged on the apron. Inside the debriefing room, both aviators provided their initial accounts. The descriptions matched to a degree that left no room for misinterpretation. The aircraft they had encountered was consistent with the developmental outlines of the MiG-29, but with performance characteristics exceeding any intelligence estimate available to NATO at that time. The officers noted its acceleration, altitude control, and the precision of the maneuver in which it rolled above them before taking a position at their rear. The most troubling report concerned the 50-second radar blackout, which coincided exactly with the MiG's proximity. Commanders from U.S. Air Forces in Europe reviewed the testimony with care, comparing it to the flight telemetry downloaded from the F-15's foot onboard systems. Their radars had recorded highly erratic returns during the encounter, punctuated by abrupt signal dropouts. When the data was plotted, the resulting track appeared incomplete, fractured by unexplained gaps. The preliminary conclusion was stark. A foreign aircraft had penetrated multiple layers of NATO's early warning systems without detection, maneuvered freely in contested airspace, and exited before pursuit could be completed. The first official report was sent to the Pentagon classified at the highest operational level. A parallel summary was delivered to NATO's headquarters in Brussels under restricted circulation. The final directive attached to both documents was unambiguous. Incident not to be disclosed. Investigations ongoing. Across the Iron Curtain, Soviet records from that date tell a different, but no less revealing story. In Kaliningrad, Senior Lieutenant Mikhailov submitted a technical log describing the intermittent radar anomaly earlier that day. His entry was noted and archived. Hours later, his command received a secure communiqué from Moscow instructing units to treat all data collected between 1500–1800 hours as classified by directive of the Air Forces Command. No explicit reference was made to a MiG-29 or to a special operation. Yet attached to that communiqué was an unusual addendum, a general reminder of evaluation sorties conducted by advanced test platforms. The wording was vague but suggestive. Several historians, upon reviewing the documents decades later, pointed to this message as possible evidence of a limited-range demonstration flight by a pre-operational MiG-29 or related prototype. But the Soviet records contained their own irregularities. In one declassified fragment, an internal intelligence memo noted unexpected NATO reaction patterns near North Sea boundary region. Another document, heavily redacted, referenced cross-border detection inconsistencies and unexpected clarity of foreign aircraft signatures. This raised an unsettling possibility. While NATO systems had been disrupted or blinded at the height of the incident, certain Soviet sensors had received unusually sharp telemetry from the same airspace. For months following the encounter, NATO analysts attempted to reconcile the conflicting pieces of evidence. Engineers reviewed the radar blackout at Bentwaters, Netished, and aboard the AWACS. Their final assessment classified the event as unexplained electromagnetic disruption. No known Soviet jamming system could account for the precise timing and localized effect. When the intelligence community re-examined the MiG-29's capabilities in later years, after the aircraft finally entered broader Soviet service, they remained certain of one fact: none of its known electronic suites matched what had been observed on the 8th of March, 1983. Despite that, some officials believed the encounter was an intentional demonstration. Others argued the opposite, that it was accidental, an unplanned crossing during a classified Soviet test flight, followed by a rapid withdrawal once detected. Yet another theory, circulating quietly within technical research groups, focused on the radar anomalies preceding the appearance: the distortion corridor, the intermittent signals picked up in Denmark, the unexplained sonar disturbances near the Norwegian Sea. When these events were overlaid on a single timeline, the resulting pattern suggested an approach route no aircraft of the era should have been able to use undetected. At NATO headquarters, An internal inquiry was conducted to determine whether gaps existed in the region's radar coverage. The audit found none sufficient to explain the event. A separate study examined whether atmospheric conditions could have masked the MiG's approach. The conclusion was negative. Even decades later, retired officers described the incident with the same tone: precise, documented, but fundamentally unresolved. In the political sphere, the event's repercussions were contained. No diplomatic protest was filed. No public acknowledgement was made. Both alliances seemed mutually committed to burying the matter beneath routine operational reports. Yet within classified circles, the incident altered threat assessments. NATO significantly expanded electronic countermeasure research in the months that followed. Funding increased for long-range low-frequency radars designed to detect stealthy or low-observable aircraft signatures. A revision of North Sea patrol routes quietly went into effect, shifting several flight corridors and extending the coverage of airborne surveillance assets. Soviet documents from the mid-1980s show parallel developments: accelerated testing of advanced avionics in the MiG-29 program, rapid deployment of new radar sites along the western military districts, and an unexplained increase in data classification surrounding prototype flights. But perhaps the most compelling detail emerged only after the Cold War ended, when a single sentence, buried in a partially declassified Soviet Air Force's evaluation, came to light. It read, "Performance parameters exceeded expectations during westward penetration trial. Further details withheld by directive." The date matched the 8th of March, 1983. To this day, analysts disagree on the meaning. Some interpret penetration trial as a deliberate test of NATO's radar network. Others argue it refers simply to a controlled flight envelope trial that wandered closer to the border than intended. Yet no document from either side has ever fully explained how an advanced Soviet fighter, one believed not yet operational, appeared at a precise point where NATO radar coverage insisted no aircraft could be. And the 50-second blackout of multiple tracking systems remains unaccounted for. In the end, most official reviews concluded with the same measured phrasing: cause undetermined, classification retained. The final image of the event endures only in pilot testimony: a silhouette climbing toward the fading light, engines glowing, vanishing into the eastern horizon, swift, silent, and impossible. A reminder of how thin the line was between known capability and hidden development, and how the Cold War skies were filled with moments that left no explanation, only questions waiting in the classified margins of history.